Hey guys! Tonight, we slip quietly into the shadows of ancient Rome, not the marble grandeur or echoing Senate halls, but the alleys behind the villas, the inner courtyards where footsteps fall soft over crushed bones and old decisions. You're standing in the humid dusk of a Roman summer, sandals sticking slightly to a tiled floor, wiped with more than water. They're shouting no, begging from behind a wooden door. You inch closer. Through a crack, you see a young man tied to a post. Shirt torn. Back rough. He's not a criminal. Not in the way you'd expect. He's a slave, and that's enough. Now imagine the same crime theft, but this time, the man is wearing a toga, bearing a citizen's ring. Instead of blood, there's paperwork. Instead of a whip, a courdat. Same act. Different flesh. That's what we're exploring tonight. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know where you're watching from, and what time it is. I'm always curious which corner of the world you're dozing off in. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background, hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking along the Via Appia, one of Rome's oldest highways. Carte Retulpast. Their wheels worn. Horses snorting under dust. A merchant patient, grumbling at a barefoot boy carrying a jug. You think it's a father and son? It isn't. That boy is property. And if the jug drops, so might his status right into the dirt. With his face, Roman society was built on status. That wasn't just wealth or family, it was your entire legal identity. At the top were Roman citizens cives Romani, guarded by laws, trial rights, and even specific modes of execution. Beneath them were freedmen, once enslaved, now half accepted. And far below were the slave servi, who didn't count as people. Not really. Legally. They were more like furniture with lungs. This matters because in Rome, punishment wasn't just about what you did. It was about who you were. A rich citizen could commit murder and face exile. A slave might break a plate and lose an eye. Historians still argue whether the Romans believed this was natural order or simply pragmatic cruelty. Either way, the results were brutal. Imagine two men stealing a loaf of bread. One's a citizen, the other a slave. The citizen might be fined or shamed, maybe slapped with a light whipping if he's very poor. The slave, he might be thrown into a pit of snakes. That's not hyperbole. Snakes were genuinely used in some private punishments. A fringe method recorded in villa diaries. It wasn't state-sanctioned, but it wasn't exactly illegal either. There was also a weird Roman sense of honor attached to suffering. If you were a citizen, flogging was considered degrading, not because it hurt, but because it made you seem like a slave. Even in punishment, the rich stayed clean. If they had to die, they died with a blade to the neck, not a nail through the wrist. You, dear listener, would not have survived this unless you were born into the right shoes. Even then, step out of line, and those shoes won't save you. You could be sold into slavery for debts. You could lose your citizen rights for scandal. And then, the system that once protected you now digests you. Sensory detail, mathered. 2. The leather whip used on slaves called the flagrum was a multi-tailed lash with bone or metal at the tips. The sound it made wasn't a crack, but a wet thud, like someone slapping raw meat. It was designed to shred, not sting. Meanwhile, the Verga, as Lender Kane, was used for citizens when they absolutely had to be disciplined. It made a sharp whistle in the air. A softer sound. Egentlig humiliation. Even children were spared. Slave children could be whipped in public by their owners. Citizen children, no. They were usually disciplined at home, behind closed doors, with concern for reputation. Same age, different treatment. You start to realize Rome didn't just enforce inequality, it ritualized it. And yet, not all citizens were safe. If you were a woman, especially a poor one, the line blurred. Women couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, and in legal courts. Their words weighed less unless they were of high class. A citizen woman might be spared a public beating, but a freed woman or a poor citizen's daughter, she might vanish into punishment with little defense. There's this fringe account, found in a crumbling mosaic inscription near Pompeii, of a slave girl named Livia, who was beaten so badly she lost the use of her left arm because she spilled wine on a senator's robe. What's notable is not the injury, but that her master was commended for maintaining discipline. Imagine that engraved in stone? That was Rome. Still, the line between law and tradition was fluid. The 12 Tables, Rome's earliest legal code, barely addressed slaves. Most punishments were left to custom, to local authority, or to the master's discretion. That meant a cruel master could maim without repercussion, but also that a kind one could protect. There are records of masters who refused to punish their slaves harshly, or even paid for their healing. But they were exceptions. Most masters ruled by fear, and fear had a smell, not just blood or sweat. But, oil burnt, lamp oil. Torches lined the walls of punishment chambers. You'd enter that space with your wrists already trembling, the clink of manacles echoing louder than footsteps. The Carnifex, Rome's executioner, rarely spoke. He didn't need to. His tools were loud enough. In case you're wondering, no, Rome didn't keep punishment behind doors. Spectacle mattered. Public pain reinforced order. You'd walk by a square and see a man chained in the sun. Skin blister. Ice, swollen shut. A slave. Certainly. A citizen rarely. And if a citizen was displayed like that, you'd know they'd done something really scandalous. Or maybe insulted the emperor. Or worse, touched a Vestal virgin. So tonight, as you shift gently under your sheets, remember, in ancient Rome, justice didn't wear a blindfold. It wore a signet ring, and it always knew who you were. You wake to the sound of chains, not the loud, theatrical clanking you hear in movies, but small. Constant mouvement, the kind of sound that creeps under your skin. It's morning in a Roman household, and you're walking alongside a slave named Tiro. He's already been up since the second watch of the night. He's fed the dogs, polished the atrium floor, and now he's fetching warm water for his master's bath. Tiro is 17. His spine is already twisted from years of carrying amphorae that outweigh him. You try to greet him. He doesn't respond. Not because he's rude, but because speaking to you could be considered impertinent. You're in the sandals of a Roman citizen. Remember, you're protected. He isn't. You can sue. He can be whipped. In fact, he will be if he makes eye contact for too long. In Rome, guilt didn't begin with the evidence. It began with your class. Every trial, every punishment, every accusation started by asking, who is this person? The question wasn't what you did, but whether you deserved to be punished like a human being. Roman citizens had provocatio, a legal right to appeal. It wasn't foolproof, but it meant you couldn't be executed or flogged without a hearing. Slaves. No such right. A master could punish them at will. They weren't just denied appeals. They weren't allowed to speak in court unless tortured for evidence. The legal system saw them as animate tools, not moral agents. Imagine that for a moment. Being a tool. If you broke, you were replaced. If you disobeyed, you were corrected, not persuaded. Not reasoned with, corrected. And yet, Romans prided themselves on justice. The concept of equitas fairness was central to their ideology. Historians still argue whether this contradiction was deliberate hypocrisy or simply compartmentalized thinking. They talked about balance, law, fairness, but built those values on a brutal hierarchy. Roman law wasn't universal. It was conditional, kind of like offering hugs, but only to people wearing a specific ring. Even in punishment, the system was tiered. If you were a Roman citizen and you were caught stealing from a temple, you might be exiled to a remote island. Humiliating. Sure, but survivable. If a slave did the same, their hands might be cut off. Or worse, nailed to the temple door as a warning. That's not just apocryphal. Pliny the Elder hints at such practices in obscure footnotes, which scholars debate feverishly. Did it happen often? Probably not. Did it happen at all? Chillingly, yes. Now take another scenario. Let's say you're a Roman citizen accused of attacking someone. You get summoned to court. Maybe fined. Maybe imprisoned in a villa for a few years. The prison might have a garden. Meanwhile, if a slave lashes out even in self-defense, they could be sentenced to death without trial. And not a clean death. Mind you, the divide wasn't just judicial, it was cultural. Citizens saw themselves as the embodiment of virtus, Roman manliness and courage. Slaves were expected to embody patientia endurance, submission, pain without complaint. That's not just poetic language. There are actual manuals from Roman philosophers, like Seneca, describing how a good slave should endure punishment without screaming. That wasn't advice. That was expectation. And yes, some slaves were born into it. Others were prisoners of war, sold off in bulk after a campaign. The average Roman general didn't just loot gold. He looted people. A victory in Gaul might mean 10,000 new slaves pouring into Roman markets. Many were branded immediately. Not with a name, but a mark of ownership. Often on the forehead. And if you think that sounds like something out of dystopian fiction, nope. That's Roman history. Cold. Precise. Bureaucratic. Some households even used a punishment scale light whip for lateness. Iron cuff for disobedience. Chained confinement for backtalk. The records are dry. Like grocery lists. Punish the Syrian boy with 3 lashes for speaking out of turn. You wonder who wrote that? Did their hands shake? Probably not. Citizens. On the other hand, we're protected even in disgrace. A senator could commit fraud and be stripped of office, but he'd still have a family tomb. Still be remembered. A slave who stole bread might disappear without burial. Just dumped. No marker. No name. Dust to dust. Anonymously. So, when you hear Roman philosophers speak of stoicism, of dignity in suffering, just remember they meant their dignity. Slaves weren't invited into that club. They were there to polish the marble steps on the way in. You step into the forum, the beating heart of Rome's civic life. It's bustling. Merchants yelling. Priests chanting. Children playing chase. And over by the rostra, a man is tied to a post. His shirt torn open. A whip cracks. The man flinches, but the crowd, they don't. It's just another punishment. Now, lean in. This isn't some lowly pickpocket or provincial rebel. This is a Roman citizen. But wait, how can that be? Isn't flogging beneath them, technically? Yes. The Lex Porcia and Lex Valeria both protected Roman citizens from corporal punishment without trial. But those laws had loopholes. If you were a lower-class citizen, especially in the army or outside Rome, you might still get flogged. You'd be disciplined, not punished. See the difference? Neither did your back. The tool mattered. For citizens, it was often the virga, a slender cane that left welts. Not scars. For slaves, the flagrum, with metal-tipped tails that tore muscle from bone. It's the Roman equivalent of the difference between a speeding ticket and a sledgehammer to the face. And here's the weird part. Slaves were expected to accept it. Cheerfully. Even. Roman thinkers like Cato the Elder insisted that good slaves needed discipline like crops needed rain. He even wrote instructions for how often to whip slaves to keep them motivated. Think of it as the world's worst HR manual. Citizens. Meanwhile, treated punishment as shame. It wasn't the pain, it was the stain on honor. If flogged, a citizen might retreat into self-imposed exile. O deben suicide. Because to be whipped was to be un-Roman. Even emperors like Augustus took care never to be seen ordering flogging on citizens too publicly. The optics mattered. A lot. Historians still argue whether this sensitivity was moral squeamishness or just class vanity. Probably both. Let's not forget the punishment venues. Slaves were flogged in public courtyards, near fountains, even in marketplaces, anywhere crowds could witness. Citizens, if flogged at all, it was in semi-private, and usually with lots of apologies. And if you're imagining an angry Roman yelling and throwing things, slow down. Most punishments were cold. Efficient. Sometimes a villicus, a slave manager, would quietly nod to the executioner. The whip would fall. And after 5 lashes, 10, 20, the punished slave might be dragged out and told to get back to work. Now let's get a little fringe. Ever heard of flagrum artistry? Some sadistic elites apparently had their initials or family crests woven into the lash. So the wounds left a pattern. It sounds like fiction, but a few ancient writers describe this with alarming casualness. Was it common doubtful? Was it possible? Absolutely. What mattered most wasn't the crime. It was the spectacle. Rome needed to see hierarchy at work. The whip wasn't just a punishment, it was an announcement. This man is beneath you. This man cannot appeal. You'd see it. You'd feel safer. That was the point. And if you were a slave and survived enough whippings, you'd get a scar map, a living record. Some slaves were sold with tags noting previous discipline. It's like buying a second-hand car and asking how often it's been in accidents. So next time someone praises Rome's legal genius, just ask legal genius for whom? The torchlight flickers in a narrow stone room. You're in the back quarter of a wealthy Roman domus. And there, under a small arch, is something you didn't expect: a branding station. Iron rods stacked neatly. A small brazier glowing faintly. Beside it, a stool and a cup of vinegar. Tonight's lesson: permanent punishment. Branding slaves was not only accepted, it was routine. If a slave ran away, the letter fug, short for fugitivus, would be seared onto their forehead. Cheek or thigh. So no matter where they ran, they'd be marked. Forever. Roman citizens. Branding was out of the question. Even criminals weren't branded unless stripped of citizenship first. That's how sacred the Roman face was. Scars might show courage. Brands showed ownership, and citizens were never owned. There are accounts of slave dealers pre-branding slaves before selling them like price stickers. Some even made brands decorative curved fonts. Ornamental shapes. It sounds ridiculous. It was also real. This wasn't just cruelty. It was marketing. One fringe detail: some slaves were tattooed instead of branded, especially in eastern provinces. The tattoos often said, tax paid or property of X household. It's debated whether this was punishment or administration. Probably both. Remember, for slaves, pain was less about crime and more about control. You didn't whip a slave to correct them. You whipped them to remind them. Branding wasn't just for fugitives. It was for troublemakers, slow learners, or those who forgot their place. And it worked. Imagine trying to escape with a giant fug on your face. You couldn't even pretend to be free. You'd be stopped, questioned, and returned. Or worse, executed for theft. Yes, theft, because running away meant stealing yourself. Property stealing itself. That's how Rome saw it. It's early morning again, and the sky over Rome is the color of bruised iron. You follow the clang of chains to a small square. A crowd has gathered. There's a wooden post in the center, and tied to it is a man trembling. Around him stand 6 guards. The air is thick, but not with excitement. With inevitability. You're about to witness crucifixion. But here's the twist: you're not allowed. Not if you're a Roman citizen. Crucifixion was reserved for slaves, foreigners, and the worst criminals. It was too brutal, too humiliating, too un-Roman for citizens. In fact, Roman law forbade crucifixion of citizens under most circumstances. Even St. Paul, when sentenced to death, was beheaded, not crucified, because of his citizenship. Crucifixion wasn't just execution, it was spectacle and message. Victims were stripped naked, nailed to a cross or tied with ropes, and left to hang for hours, sometimes days. Bazirtshovered. People jeered, and the body stayed up long after death, rotting in the sun. One scholarly debate persists: were nails the norm, or the exception? Ancient writers disagree. Some say nails were common. Others describe tying as more typical. Archaeological evidence supports both, with one famous skeleton showing a heel bone pierced by an iron spike. Slaves were crucified for rebellion. Theft. Escape sometimes just for angering a master. During the Spartacus revolt, over 6. 0 slaves were crucified along the Via Appia. Imagine walking that road, mile after mile of hanging corpses. That wasn't justice. That was policy. Roman citizens, if they had to be executed, they got the sword. Fast. Clean. Often with honor rites. Some even chose suicide to avoid the indignity of state execution. So tonight, if you're feeling grateful for your soft bed, your locked door, your right to speak, just remember in Rome, one wrong birth could cost you your humanity. Or worse, your death could be used as a roadside warning. You're standing on worn stone steps just outside the Flavian Amphitheatre. Not yet the Colosseum of tourist photos. But still, magnificent arches rising like frozen waves. The scent of iron and sweat baked into the mortar. It's morning, and a crowd gathers. Vendors hawk figs and cheap wine. Children fidget on their father's shoulders. You're here for punishment, but not just any punishment. You're here for the show. Tonight's lesson, punishment as theater. In Rome, justice wasn't always blind. Sometimes it wore makeup and played to a sold-out crowd. And the actors' slaves, prisoners of war. And the condemned, you glance around and notice it's festive. There's laughter, anticipation, as if everyone's here for a chariot race or a comedy. And in a sense, they are. Roman authorities understood something terrifyingly. Modern public punishment was a form of control. But more than that, it was entertainment. You couldn't just execute someone quietly. You needed to display it, shape it, direct it like a play. And the audience, they weren't just there to watch. They were there to remember. This is what happens to people who aren't you. And here's the key difference. If the condemned is a citizen, especially one of note, the punishment is usually private, sterile, discreet, maybe exile, maybe a veiled execution in a villa far away. But if they're a slave, you bet they get a crowd. One of the most infamous spectacles involved damnatio ad bestia's condemnation to the beasts. Imagine being thrown into an arena with a half-starved lion. The gates opening slow and dramatic. The sun blazing off your back as the crowd roars louder than the cat. And no, it wasn't always lions. Sometimes it was leopards, bears, or even packs of wild dogs trained to rip limbs. One fringe case ostriches. Not deadly, but humiliating. The bird might peck. But the real sting was in the jeers. Citizens rarely faced such ends. And when they did, it was usually because they'd lost citizenship or crossed the emperor. Punishment for them had to preserve dignitas. But for slaves, dignity was never part of the conversation. The idea was simple. Turn fear into a civic event. Make execution not just a deterrent, but a ritual. That's why these events had intermissions. Music. Even opening acts. You could spend an entire afternoon watching people die. Then get a sausage. Laugh with your friend. Head home to dinner. Historians still debate whether the average Roman was desensitized or deliberately conditioned. Some accounts speak of tears and protests. Others describe bored spectators calling for more blood. The truth? Probably both. Human nature is a fickle thing. You hear the announcer now. He lists the charges not in legalese, but for drama. This man stole from his master. This woman poisoned her owner. And then it begins. The crowd falls silent. For a moment, it's almost holy. And then the screams start. You stand still. You don't look away. Because if you do, someone might think you sympathize. And in Rome, sympathy is dangerous. It implies equality. So as the sun sets and the crowd begins to disperse, you feel something cold in your chest. This wasn't just a show. It was a warning. A message carved into flesh. Don't forget your place. Or this could be you. It's Kieter now. You're deep in the belly of a Roman villa. In the service quarters, a space the size of a broom closet. With no windows, and the faint stink of burnt metal clinging to the air. There's a woman here. She's kneeling. Her hair has been hacked short. Her clothes rougher than sackcloth. On her forehead, a fresh mark. 3 angry letters burned into the skin. She's been branded. Tonight's topic, permanent punishment. Not death. Not flogging, but marks that never fade. For slaves, branding was a common penalty. If they ran, they were marked. If they spoke out of turn, they were marked. Sometimes, even when they did nothing at all, just to prevent them from trying anything later. The letters FUG, short for fugitivus, weren't just a label. They were a sentence in themselves. A walking billboard that read, "This one tried to be free." And where were these brands placed? The forehead, the cheek, the back of the hand. Somewhere visible, somewhere shameful. Branding was less about punishment and more about humiliation. A way to say, you are not only property, you are damaged property. Roman citizens. They were exempt. Branding a citizen was a grotesque violation of Roman dignity. Even serious criminals, unless stripped of citizenship, were spared that fate. The face, to Romans, was sacred. It represented family, honor, bloodline. You could scar a man's back, but never his cheek. Unless, of course, he wasn't a man, just a tool with legs. There's a fringe story from the Annals of Tacitus about a freedman who covered his branded forehead with a wig of false curls. He tried to pass as a citizen until someone noticed him sweating too hard and the curls slipped. He was arrested on the spot. The law was clear. False identity was treason, but only because he dared to rise above his station. Some slaves bore multiple brands, layers of punishment from different owners, like stamps in a cursed passport. And yes, branding hurt. The iron was heated until white hot and pressed without mercy. No anesthetic. Maybe some vinegar afterward? Maybe. Sometimes owners would brand their house symbol instead of letters. A stylized sun. A pine cone. Even a bird. It sounds almost whimsical until you realize that slave might be sold again. And then again. And now he's got 3 brands from 3 homes. His body is a map of pain. Citizens could lose their citizenship for crimes, but even then, branding was rare, reserved for traitors. for parricides, for the most despised. The shame was too great. You didn't mark a Roman face unless you wanted to erase it from memory. Historians still argue whether branding was more psychological than physical. Some say the pain was secondary, that it was about ownership, a constant reminder of failure. Others say it was meant to strip hope. You can't dream of escape when your forehead tells the world what you are. You leave the room. The woman doesn't look up. She knows better. Her brand is fresh. Her fate is sealed. And all you can do is walk away into the light, carrying the memory of her silence with you. The air is sticky, the kind that clings to your skin like guilt. You're in the outskirts now, near the cattle fields of the Esquiline, far from the marble arches and basilicas, far from the polite whispers of senators and wine merchants. Here, you find crosses. Not many, just one or two. Old, weathered, and empty now. But they speak louder than the Forum ever could. Tonight's horror, the Crucifixion divide. Crucifixion was Rome's loudest punishment. Not in volume, but in message. It was brutal, slow, humiliating, and absolutely reserved for those outside the citizenry. To be crucified was to be publicly erased, and for Rome, that meant anyone who didn't belong slaves. Foreigners. Rebels. The process was intentionally drawn out. You weren't just killed. You were displayed, stripped, naked. Yes. Always naked, tied, or nailed to a wooden beam. The vertical post, called the stipes, was often fixed in place. The condemned carried the horizontal beam, the patibulum, on their back sometimes over 100 pounds. The death, not fast. You'd hang there for hours, sometimes days. Your muscles would cramp. Your lungs would collapse slowly. You might vomit. Or choke. Or bleed out. Or just slip into shock from heat and dehydration. And again, this was not for Roman citizens. Ever wonder why Paul was beheaded? That's why. Crucifixion was so humiliating that even in the darkest of times, emperors avoided using it on citizens. It was punishment designed to unmake you, body and soul. One fringe practice, letting the bodies hang after death. As a warning, crows picked at the eyes, flies bred in the wounds. And still the body stayed because the real punishment was meant for the living who watched. There are cases where slaves were crucified not for crime, but for inconvenience. Displeasing a master. Looking wrong at the wrong time. No trial. No hearing. Just accusation and execution. The master had the legal right to do it. As long as no major law was broken, the only limit, don't cause a riot. That's it. The sheer disparity is sickening. While a citizen might appeal a sentence for weeks, hire an orator. Charm? The judge? A slave had no such voice. Their fate depended on their master's mood and their own silence. Break that silence. You might find yourself hanging beside the road. As the sun rises on another indifferent morning, historians still argue how often crucifixion happened. Was it rare and symbolic, or common and calculated? The evidence points both ways. Some say it was exceptional, others say it was routine enough to be mundane. A terrifying thought. You step back from the field. One of the crosses creaks in the wind. There's no one on it now, but your mind fills in the shape. The ropes, the nails, the eyes pleading for something no one's offering. You wouldn't survive it. Not if you were born in chains. You can smell the amphitheater before you see it iron. Sweat, dung, and roasted barley cakes mingling in the morning air. You're back in the heart of Rome, standing in line for an event not advertised in scrolls or marble. It's not a chariot race, not a gladiator match. Today is something darker, more creative, and far less remembered. You've come for what Romans might have called poenae extraordinariae, extraordinary punishments. These were the executions reserved for when regular pain just wasn't enough. You pass under the shaded entryway and squint into the arena's light. You're just in time. A gate creaks open. A man stumbles into the sand. He's unarmed. Beside him, two handlers prod something forward. A beast. No, not just one. Two wild boars. Tusks polished. Eyes wide with hunger. A cruel joke. Not at all. Welcome to death by imagination. Rome didn't just kill slaves, it styled their deaths. Crucifixion was only the beginning. If a slave stole something sacred, or injured their master's family, or simply offended a powerful person, the death could be customized. There are fringe records passed down through second-hand letters and private collections that speak of slaves being sewn into sacks with wild animals and tossed into rivers. Poinakujei, the punishment for parricide, was mostly applied to citizens who killed parents, but some scholars suggest versions were used for slaves accused of killing the household spirit. Into the sack went a dog, a monkey, a rooster, and a viper. It wasn't just torture, it was symbolic chaos. You drown while being clawed and bitten. A theatrical unmaking of order. And here, in the arena, the logic is similar. The beasts don't kill swiftly. They nip, tear, chase. The crowd gasps and laughs. You watch the condemned try to dodge the boars, running in desperate circles until he trips. A handler whistles. A leopard is released. Then, silence. Citizens never got this treatment. Even the worst citizen criminals were rarely fed to animals. That was beneath Rome's dignity. But slaves? Their deaths were tools. A way to set examples. You can imagine a magistrate whispering to the crowd, "See what happens when property rebels." One especially cruel execution method involved setting slaves on fire, tied to stakes with oil-drenched tunics. Fire as punishment wasn't unheard of in other cultures. But Rome turned it into ritual. The flames were said to cleanse the slaves' disobedience, as if their ashes could atone for stepping out of line. Historians still argue how widespread these methods were. Some claim they were rare and ceremonial. Others say they were common, especially during tense political times. After all, terror works best when you make it memorable. And make no mistake, these punishments were remembered, engraved into family histories, painted on villa walls, whispered about in servant quarters. You can almost hear the warning. Don't end up like Lucius's slave. You know, the one with the dogs. So tonight, as your fan hums and your blankets gather warmth, remember that, in Rome, not all deaths were equal. Some were carefully scripted, elaborate, slow, because to the Romans, death wasn't just an end. It was a message. And if you were a slave, that message was written in fire. Fangs and fear. It's a quiet corridor now, just a marble hall lined with heavy doors. You step into a room filled with lamps and silence. In the center, a short wooden block. Beside it, a man kneels calmly. He wears a simple tunic, but he's clean. Not trembling, not chained. His gaze is steady. The crowd is smaller here, just officials. Maybe a scribe. A sword gleams nearby. This, dear listener, is how a Roman citizen dies. Tonight, we explore the citizen's sword, a cleaner, quieter, and far more respectable path to death than what you've seen so far. Because in Rome, even execution had a class system. Beheading was considered honorable, a swift, dignified method of capital punishment, usually reserved for Roman citizens, and even then, only when they lost their rights or committed treason. The procedure was clinical. A kneel, a word, a single stroke. If the executioner was skilled, sometimes, if the condemned had rank or favor, they were allowed to fall on their sword in private. Suicide was often granted as a privilege. The logic Rome saw itself as the paragon of order. Blood could be spilled. Yes, but not sprayed. Torture, mutilation, and humiliation were for others. A good Roman death was about restraint. And yet, execution was still rare for citizens. Most crimes were met with exile, fines, or reassignment. Death came only when the system needed to erase someone. Politically, publicly. But even then, the body was returned to the family. Funerals were held. Names en gravez. Contrast that with the nameless slave hanged in the villa courtyard, left overnight for the dogs. Samin paya. Two universes. And of course, there were exceptions. Some emperors flouted the rules. Caligula famously had citizens flogged and executed in the arena. Nero played citizen corpses like theater props. But even then, the outrage they caused came not from killing citizens, but from killing them like slaves. There's a fringe account of a senator who requested to be flogged before death to understand what his slaves had suffered. The executioner refused. "It is not fitting," he said. Even in death, a line had to be maintained. Historians still argue whether this was compassion or self-glorification. Did Rome spare citizens pain because it cared, or because it needed to believe in its own myth of superiority? The symbolism ran deep. The sword wasn't just a blade. It was a clean line between citizen and beast. One man dies with a poem, another with a scream, and here's a final whisper sometimes. The condemned was allowed to bring a friend, a final meal, a few words. Aquietan. So as your night settles, and you listen to the hum of your room, remember that even in its darkest acts, Rome maintained form, but not for everyone. Only for the lucky few. The rest, well, they got the spectacle. You wake in a cramped stone chamber. Torches flicker dimly. Iron rings line the walls. A table stands in the center wood, stained dark, corners worn smooth from decades of elbows and fear. Beside it, a pair of tongs, a sponge, and a whip. You've just stepped into one of Rome's most brutal paradoxes where truth is carved from pain. Tonight's cruelty, torture as testimony. In the Roman legal system, slaves could not testify in court unless tortured first. The reasoning slaves had no honor, and thus no incentive to tell the truth. Only pain. It was believed, could wring honesty from their mouths. So, if you were a Roman citizen and needed evidence against a slave, You could petition the magistrate to authorize torture, not for punishment, just to ask questions. The procedure was called quaestio, per tormenta inquiry. Through torment, tools varied. The rack, for stretching joints. Fire, for burning toes and fingers. The scorpion, a short, barbed whip designed to peel skin. Sometimes boiling water, sometimes salt in wounds. It wasn't about confession. It was about breaking resistance. And yes, sometimes the slave survived and was thanked for their honesty. Imagine that, being beaten within an inch of your life, then praised for your cooperation. Meanwhile, Roman citizens protected. Torturing a citizen, even one accused of murder, was strictly prohibited. Their testimony was considered valid on honor alone. Only under emperors like Domitian or Caracalla did this rule occasionally bend. And when it did, the Senate often protested. One fringe case, an elite woman disguised as a slave was tortured during an inheritance dispute. Her real identity was only discovered after the fact, too late. The magistrate resigned in disgrace. The judge who authorized it, stripped of his estate. The stain of torturing a citizen was too great. No matter the disguise, historians still argue whether torture actually produced truth. Some suggest it created more lies than answers. But Rome didn't care. The process was more important than the result. Pain was the currency of clarity. And for some slaves, being tortured to speak meant a chance to matter. A cruel irony pain as the only path to personhood. So, you sit in this chamber now, a spectator to this system. The torchlight casts long shadows. The walls remember every scream. And somewhere outside, in the marble court, a verdict is written based on the truth wrung from torn lips. The clang of a chain echoes through the courtyard like a punctuation mark. You step outside into the bright sun, but the mood is anything but light. A man is dragged forward barefoot, bleeding, gasping. He ran. He got caught. And now he'll wear the price. Tonight's symbol, the iron collar of shame. This wasn't a myth. Slaves who attempted escape, or even seemed likely to, were fitted with iron collars around their necks. Sometimes permanent, sometimes bolted shut. Often inscribed, the collars bore warnings. Simple, brutal messages, like I have run away. Return me to my master. Or, hold me. I am a fugitive. They were like livestock tags, but for people, and if the slave did run again, the collar ensured that every Roman knew what he was. No hiding. No pretending. Just cold. Clanging shame. Citizens never wore such things. Even those exiled or imprisoned had dignity maintained. Shackling a citizen, especially in public, was seen as a grotesque overreach of authority. Only in the direst cases, such as debt imprisonment or military desertion, where citizens shackled, and never with permanent collars. There's a fringe record of a slave who welded his collar open using stolen firewood and a bucket of oil. He fled, reached Hispania, and lived as a fisherman for 8 years. When he was finally captured, his former master demanded a public execution, but the local magistrate refused. He earned his freedom. He reportedly said, the master had a seizure from rage. Not all collars were functional. Some were ceremonial worn during festivals as mock punishments. But for escapees, it was deadly serious. The collar made sleeping difficult. Eating was hard. Social interaction was poisoned. You were your shame. In metal, historians debate whether the collar was more about punishment or prevention. Did it work? Mostly. Yes. Few dared to run twice. And those who did often didn't make it far. Rome's roads were long, but not blind. And everyone knew to read the iron. So, as you roll over in your sheets tonight, brushing hair from your face, think of those who slept with metal biting their neck, who heard every step behind them as a possible captor, who dreamed not of revenge, but of quiet. You're following a faint, metallic clinking now. Not loud, just steady, like the rhythm of someone too tired to run and too scared to stop. You turn a corner, and there she is, a girl no older than 15, dressed in rags, shuffling slowly down a villa corridor. Her feet are chained, her eyes are low, but it's her neck that draws your gaze. Around it, a wide iron collar gleams dully, its edges notched from months of wear. But what makes you freeze is the inscription: I belong to Felix. I stole honey. Do not trust me. This is the Roman collar of shame in its most humiliating form, not just a brand, but a public biography. Tonight, we're talking about inscriptions. Not monuments or marble, but iron, fire, and skin. Slave collars weren't just tools, they were messages. Rome understood something all too modern. Public shaming is often more effective than physical pain. The inscription told your story. If you ran away, if you talked back, if you broke a plate, it went on the collar. Sometimes painted, sometimes engraved. It might say, "Fug" for fugitive, or "Retinite," hold me. Sometimes even a name and address. Like a lost package. I am the property of Publius Aelius. Returned to his estate near the Tiber. A Roman citizen? Never. A citizen might be fined, or forced to wear simple garments during mourning. But to be collared, that was unthinkable. Even a drunk, disorderly plebeian in the gutter retained more visual dignity than the slave who stole a fig. There's a fringe case from the graffiti of Pompeii. A servant woman named Fortunata was collared for laughing during a funeral. The inscription reads, "Fortunata, who mocks the dead. May her tongue rot." Was it a joke? An exaggeration? Scholars still debate whether this collar existed or was just a verbal curse etched into wall poetry. Either way, the intent was real. Humiliate, restrain, warn, and some collars weren't meant to be removed. They were soldered shut, requiring a blacksmith to cut off, usually only if the slave was sold or pardoned. Otherwise, it stayed for weeks, for years, for life. You imagine walking with that weight, sleeping with it pressing into your throat, eating while people read your shame out loud. Oh, look, it's the one who stole olives. You're not a person. You're a crime with legs. Historians argue whether this form of punishment was efficient or excessive. Some Roman manuals warn against overuse. It makes slaves more desperate, more likely to revolt. Others encouraged it, claiming it lowered escape rates by over 70%. One scribe notes, chillingly, that collars turn men into dogs, loyal, quiet, and grateful. You look back at the girl. Her steps have slowed, not from fatigue, but because the collar has rubbed her neck raw. H movement slices hair open again. She doesn't cry. She knows better. Tears would only prove her guilt. So tonight, in your softness and silence, try to imagine what it means to carry your worst moment forever. To wear it. To sleep with it. To be judged by it every day. By people who already decided you weren't really human to begin with. You wake up in the middle of the night to muffled screams. Not loud, but gutting. You're standing in the corner of a Roman villa, lit only by a dying oil lamp. You follow the sound to a chamber with a barred door. Inside are 5 slaves, 2 men, 2 women, and a child barely walking. Their faces are blank, but their wrists raw from new ropes. Tonight's lesson is crueler than most collective punishment. In Rome, the law didn't stop at the individual, especially not when it came to slaves. If one slave committed a crime, say, murdering their master, the entire household of slaves could be executed. No trial, no appeals, just mass death. The logic fear is more reliable than love. The most infamous case comes from 61 CE, when a Roman official named Pedanius Secundus was murdered by one of his household slaves. He owned over 400 point. Despite protests from the public and even some senators, the state ordered every one of them executed, including women, including children. You read that right? Babies. Infants born into bondage. They were considered legal extensions of the household, not persons with innocence. The assumption was chilling if the killer wasn't identified. Then they all shared guilt by association, by silence, by sheer proximity. Roman citizens never subjected to this. If a citizen murdered someone, only they were tried. Their family might suffer socially, but they wouldn't be executed for his crime. The law drew a hard line between people and property, and slaves were property. If one acted out, the rest were defective. There's a fringe account from a merchant's journal about a slave who tried to stop his fellow from killing the master. He shouted, wrestled the knife away, but it was too late. Still, he was crucified with the others. His name, Tiberius Lanto. His grave, unmarked. Historians debate whether this policy was meant to discourage rebellion or simply preserve power. Either way, it sent a clear message. You don't just belong to your master, you belong to his fate. The public rarely intervened. Sometimes there were protests. But more often, the executions were carried out in sequence. First the adults, then the older children, then the youngest, silent lines, one by one. Up to the post or the blade, you picture the child now grasping her mother's hand, not understanding. You picture the guards, trying not to meet her eyes. You picture the magistrate, signing the order and sipping wine. And you wonder how many knew this was wrong, but said nothing. So tonight, if you hear a whisper in the dark, maybe it's just the fan. Or maybe it's the memory of those who were punished not for what they did, but for what someone else did near them. The room smells of perfume. Not fresh heavy. Cloying. Sweet. In a way that hides something else underneath. You're in a villa's garden chamber, where cushions are scattered. Laughter still lingers, and the wine is only half drunk. But the room is empty now, except for the broken tray on the floor and the slave girl who dropped it. She's kneeling, eyes down, breathing fast. Her master approaches face tight with fury. She's young, maybe 13, and a guest has been offended. Tonight, we enter one of Rome's ugliest corners, gendered punishment. Because being a slave was brutal. But being a female slave, that was something else entirely. In theory, Roman law recognized rape and sexual assault as crimes. But in practice, that recognition only applied when the victim was free. Even then, the law cared more about property and status than about consent. If a Roman citizen assaulted a slave, it was considered damage to property. If a slave resisted, they could be punished for insubordination. Let that sink in. Female slaves were particularly vulnerable. Not just to beatings or neglect, but to daily violation. A male citizen might be prosecuted for raping another man's wife or daughter, but his slaves, no such protections. A slave's body was considered legally accessible to their master. And if she bore a child from such acts, the child was born a slave. 2. There's a fringe mosaic found near Ostia, showing a chained woman beside the Latin word serva. Above her, a man raises a staff, not a whip, but a rod. Some scholars argue it depicts erotic discipline. Others believe it's a representation of punishment for sexual resistance. Either way, it's soaked in power imbalance and gender-affected punishment styles. Female slaves were more likely to be whipped publicly, their hair cut short, their clothes torn deliberately for humiliation. If they were accused of seduction or corrupting a male heir, they might be raped and flogged as punishment. Roman women, too, faced limitations, but their citizenship shielded them from such horrors. A citizen woman could sue. She had dowry rights. If raped, her family could pursue justice. But a slave girl, if she screamed, it was insubordination. If she didn't, it was consent. Historians still argue whether there were secret networks of women who tried to protect slave girls, wealthy Roman matrons who intervened behind closed doors. The evidence is sparse. A few letters, a few funerary inscriptions, but even a few glimmers suggest resistance wasn't impossible. You look again at the girl. She hasn't moved. The wine is spreading slowly across the tiles, like a stain that might get her killed. And you realize the crime wasn't spilling the wine. It was being powerless near someone powerful. So tonight, as you lie in your own space, remember that in ancient Rome, a heartbeat wasn't enough to make you human. Not if you were female, not if you were enslaved, not if you were both. The door slams shut behind you, and the silence is instant. Too clean, too final. You're inside the holding cell of a Roman domus, the master's private chamber of discipline. The walls are thick, muffling sound, but you can still hear breathing. Shallow, panicked. Across from you sits a man middle-aged, hands tied behind him, blood at the corner of his mouth. He's barefoot, his tunic shredded. He's a slave, and he's done the unthinkable. He killed his master, or at least, that's what they say. No one saw it happen. No confession has been made, but the master is dead. And that's all Rome needs to know. Tonight, we descend into one of the most chilling policies in Roman law, universal slave retribution. If a master was murdered, and the guilty party unknown, all of that master's slaves could be condemned to death. No exceptions, no trial, just obliteration by association. We've mentioned the case before. Pedanius Secundus, the prefect, whose murder led to the execution of over 400 slaves in one day, the public was outraged. Protesters filled the forum, but the Senate overruled them. The law was clear. If a master could be killed without retaliation, the entire structure of Rome's hierarchy would crumble. This wasn't about guilt. It was about deterrence. You look back at the man. He whispers something not in Latin, but Greek, maybe Thracian. You don't know. It doesn't matter. Rome doesn't care where you came from. Once you wear the chain, your fate is tethered to your owner's heartbeat. Even if you tried to stop the murder, even if you were asleep, even if you were in another part of the villa entirely, none of that mattered. The logic went, if you were a good slave, you would have died defending your master. If you didn't, you failed your only purpose. Citizens, if a Roman plebeian stabbed a senator, his friends and family might be questioned, but they wouldn't be executed. Rome punished intent, not proximity, unless you were property. There's a fringe account of a slave named Elpis who sent word of a master's poisoning before it happened. She overheard the plot and warned the guards, but was still executed with the rest. Why? Because the poison had already been ingested. Too late. She had failed to prevent the act. Historians still argue about the philosophical roots of this law. Was it rooted in fear, political pragmatism, or some warped version of collective responsibility, likely all three? Rome feared nothing more than invisible rebellion. And so, in cases like this, slaves were rounded up, marched to the execution field. Men, women, elderly, children, sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds, bound together, slaughtered together. You try to breathe, but the air is heavy with the weight of this truth. In Rome, the rope around your wrist wasn't just a tool of labor. It was a fuse. And if your master died, so did your chance at survival. You step into a shaded atrium where the sunlight filters through vines tangled above a marble fountain. It's quiet here. Unnervingly so, on a stone bench sits an old man, straight-backed, motionless, his eyes cast toward the ground. You'd think he was meditating until you notice the slight tremble in his fingers, and the boy kneeling before him, the boy isn't crying. He's waiting. What you're witnessing is the invocation of an ancient, terrible, right? Ius vitae nescisc, the master's right of life and death. Tonight, we open the scrolls of Roman domestic power, not state law, not criminal code, but the rawest, oldest authority of all, a master's sovereign right over his slave's body and existence. In the early republic, this right was nearly absolute. A master could execute a slave without trial, without reason, without scrutiny. The slave was res, a thing, and the thing belonged to him. He didn't need to justify it. He could do it for theft, for disrespect, for breaking a dish, or for no reason at all. Over time, especially during the Empire, some legal limitations emerged. Emperors like Hadrian and Antoninus Pius issued edicts advising mercy and limiting cruelty, but they weren't laws with teeth. They were suggestions. The general rule remained, unless the killing was unusually public or egregiously wasteful, few questions would be asked. The logic was simple. If you own the lamp, you can smash it. If you own the ox, you can slaughter it. And if you own the man, well, you can decide when his time ends. Citizen households were expected to self-regulate. Philosophers like Seneca and Pliny wrote long passages encouraging kinder treatment of slaves. Some even called for shared meals. Light discipline and educational efforts, but these were ideals, not mandates. For every kind master, there were dozens who ruled by fear. There's a fringe tale of a master who killed his slave for singing off-key during dinner. When questioned, he simply shrugged. The air was ruined. No punishment followed. After all, his house, his rules. But things got more complicated in urban settings. In cities like Rome, Alexandria, or Antioch, where slaves mingled, shared quarters, and passed rumors. Abuse could trigger uprisings. Masters became more cautious, not kinder, just smarter. The real shift came with the praefectus urbi, the urban prefect who began overseeing complaints against particularly cruel masters, but again, only if someone cared enough to report it. And if witnesses existed, and if the prefect wanted to intervene. Historians argue whether this right was ever truly curtailed. Some see the imperial period as a moral evolution. Others believe it was a shift in optics. Not substance. The blade remained sharp. It just glimmered less. You glance again at the boy. He hasn't been struck. Not yet. But the master is still deciding, and in this moment, one thought curls in your spine in ancient Rome. Being owned meant you lived on borrowed time, renewed with every breath you didn't take too loudly. You walk through a narrow alley in the Subura district, past looms clacking in tiny workshops and incense curling from worn temples, and then you see him, a man leaning against a doorway. Tunic faded, but posture proud. He nods at a passing merchant. The merchant nods back. Mutual respect. Because this man, this weathered figure, is a freedman. He used to be a slave. Tonight, we leave the pit and walk toward the hope that shimmered for many slaves like an unreachable star: manumission freedom. In Rome, manumission wasn't rare. Slaves could be freed by will, by reward, or by purchase. Some saved small coins from tips or secret gifts, collecting for years. Others were granted freedom as a sign of loyalty or cunning. There were ceremonies for it. The vindicta, a symbolic touch of a rod. The master's declaration in front of a magistrate, or a simple inscription on a will I release him. Upon manumission, the slave became a libertus, a freedman. Not a full citizen, but not a slave either. They received limited rights, could marry, own property, even run a business. But they owed obsequium, a kind of respectful loyalty to their former master, now called their patronus, and they carried scars, both legal and literal. A freedman could not hold public office, could not become a senator. Their children, though full citizens, it was a gateway to a better life, just not always for them. There's a fringe record from an epitaph near Puteoli. I was born in chains. I bought myself with bricks. My son will speak in the Senate. The man, a former construction slave who earned freedom through labor, his son later listed in the rolls as a junior magistrate. And yet, freedom came with strings. A freedman could be re-enslaved for disrespecting his patron. Some masters freed slaves not out of kindness, but for appearances. If that freedman embarrassed them, back in chains, freed women had it harder, often expected to remain celibate or loyal to their patron's household. And if they bore children, their guardianship often remained in the hands of the patron. Citizens looked down on freedmen, called them upstarts. Parvenus? If a freedman became wealthy running a bathhouse, bakery, or shipping firm, they were still mocked in plays and poetry. You could have gold rings, but never true status. Historians debate whether Rome's manumission system was genuinely benevolent or a clever release valve let a few escape to give hope to the rest. Some say it reflected Rome's flexibility. Others, its cruelty in disguise. You glance back at the man in the alley. He lifts his chin. Not proudly, but determinedly. He's free. And that means something. Not everything, but something. So tonight, while you dream in softness, remember this truth even in Rome. Some chains could be broken, but the wrists, they always remembered. The rain falls lightly over the forum, tapping off togas and statues alike. You duck under a marble colonnade and spot him, a man dressed modestly, carrying scrolls, his face stern. He's not rich, but he walks with purpose. He's a citizen, and he knows the law because it barely protects him. Tonight's shadow topic, the poor Roman citizen. We've talked a lot about slaves, and about the elite. But what about the mass of freeborn men and women Civs Romani who didn't own villas, didn't command legions, didn't even have a servant to carry their groceries? These people, though technically protected by Roman law, lived in a delicate balance. Yes, they couldn't be whipped without trial. Yes, they had rights. But wealth bought power, and without wealth, even those rights could feel paper thin. Imagine being dragged into court for a debt. The judge, a senator. The creditor, wealthy and well-connected. You, a cobbler's son with a single tunic to your name. Yes, you have legal standing, but justice in Rome wasn't blind. It was transactional. And punishment? It could be harsh. If you were convicted of fraud or theft and couldn't pay a fine, you might be imprisoned, publicly shamed, or even enslaved temporarily to repay your debt. It wasn't permanent, but tell that to your back after 30 lashes. There's a fringe account in Cicero's notes of a poor man sentenced to public flogging after a failed tax petition. The punishment was legal, but unusual. He had no advocate, no coin for bribery, just his skin. Even the citizen's sword wasn't always clean for the poor. Some executions for the lower classes were bungled dull blades. Zonken executioners. Mercy wasn't evenly distributed. Historians argue whether this inequality was structural or incidental. Was it built into the law, or the result of who enforced it? Maybe both. Rome loved hierarchy. And even within freedom, some were freer than others. So while poor citizens could never be branded or crucified, they could still suffer immensely. Their bodies weren't quite property, but they weren't exactly sacred either. They floated in a gray space. Not slaves, not senators, just men trying to breathe, and if they crossed a line, missed a payment, insulted a patrician, got too loud during a riot, they could find themselves in chains faster than you can say Lex Julia. So tonight, if you ever feel powerless in the eyes of systems too vast to grasp, know that you're not the first. And in Rome, even citizenship wasn't always a shield. Sometimes, it was a thin sheet in the rain. You're walking past the steps of the Basilica Julia now. The crowd thinner than usual, too early for lawsuits, too late for gossip. You pass marble columns streaked with grime, chipped from centuries of judgment, and pause to watch a curious little scene. A young man well-dressed, finely perfumed, is arguing with a pair of lictors. They're asking for identification. He's insisting on his citizenship. This, dear listener, is the difference money makes? Tonight, we lift the veil on the unspoken caste within Roman citizenship itself, because not all citizens were created equal. Being civis Romanus gave you rights, but being a wealthy citizen gave you power. It shaped the way you were punished, or if you were punished at all. Let's start with the basics. Rome's class system wasn't just about birth, it was calibrated by wealth. At the top were the senators landed, connected, effectively untouchable, unless they angered the emperor. Then came the equestrians, the business elite. Below them, the plebeians, your average citizen. They had legal rights, but few legal resources. And finally, the capite censi, the head count. Citizens in name, poor in everything else. If you were a senator, you could not be flogged, could not be publicly executed, could not be tried by a common court. Even exile for you was dressed in euphemism. He is traveling for health. They might say, while you sipped wine on a hill in Sicily, and if you were caught in a scandal, you could buy your way out. Ir orator. Offer tributes. Claim sacrosanctitas. Or make subtle donations to the temple. Wealth made the law bendable, flexible, optional. Now, imagine the same offense. A theft? Un assault. A taxe evasion. A rich senator might be reprimanded. A poor plebeian might be beaten. A freedman might be fined into ruin. A slave crucified. 4 men. Same crime. 4 vastly different endings. There's a fringe story of a corrupt magistrate caught embezzling grain. Instead of prosecution, he paid to fund a public festival and the charges disappeared. In contrast, a butcher's apprentice who skimmed a few coins from a fish sale was sentenced to 10 lashes in the forum. Historians still debate whether this inequality was seen as natural or scandalous. Some argue the elite believed their virtue was equal to their wealth. Thus, fewer punishments. Others think everyone just played along because, well, money moves marble. Even in the army, a citizen's class shaped his punishments. A noble who deserted might face demotion or be reassigned to a distant post. A poor recruit, he might be stoned by his comrades under fustuarium. A brutal form of discipline. And still, Rome called itself a republica, a state of the people. But when the people were priced like wine grades, justice aged differently in each bottle. So, as you lie warm and quiet tonight, ask yourself, what would your status be in Rome? Not just your freedom, but your worth. Because in this world, being free wasn't enough. You had to be rich enough to make that freedom stick. The cobblestones are slick with rain now, and you slip slightly as you make your way down a narrow street in the Aventine. Ahead of you, a crowd gathers around a platform. On it, a young man kneels, shirt torn, hands bound, expression frozen. He's a citizen. You overhear, but poor and poor. In this city, exposed. Tonight's truth is about the fragility of the poor citizen. You've already seen how the elite live. Now, watch how quickly the law forgets you when your coin purse is empty. Roman law recognized citizenship as sacred, but that sacredness came with strings. If you couldn't afford a legal defense, if you didn't have patrons, if your name held no weight, then your rights were theoretical, at best. Even the appeal system, provocatio, was expensive. You had to bribe clerks, pay scribes, maybe even rent a toga, if you wanted to appear respectable in court. And once you were accused, your ability to delay punishment or buy time often depended entirely on wealth. Couldn't pay a fine. You might be flogged instead. Couldn't afford exile. You might be imprisoned, though. Roman prisons were rare and temporary. More like holding cells than long-term punishment. Here's a fringe case. A baker's son was accused of striking a wealthy merchant during a brawl. He insisted he was defending his sister. But the merchant had connections. The boy was whipped publicly. Years later, that same boy, now a soldier, was honored for bravery in Germania, but he never forgot. My back still aches more than my shield, he joked bitterly. Historians argue whether the Republic's ideal of equality under law ever really applied to the poor. The 12 Tables codified basic rights but left room for judicial discretion. And discretion, in Rome, often leaned toward whoever smelled the nicest and arrived in a litter. Even punishments like labor service or conscription into dangerous military units were tools to punish the poor while sparing the rich. You didn't see equestrians digging ditches. That was for the plebs. And if you were wrongly accused, well, truth was a luxury. Sometimes, you didn't need to prove innocence. You needed someone richer to vouch for you. So tonight, as you stretch your limbs and drift off, know that even the proudest Roman words, libertas, aequitas, civitas, were shaped by coin and class. And freedom, without money, was little more than a whisper in the wind. The moon is high tonight, and the street lamps are dimming as oil runs low. You're near the Temple of Vesta, where shadows curl around marble like black ivy. There's a strange quiet here, broken only by whispers, and one of them belongs to a woman in chains. She's not just any slave. She's a female slave. Tonight, we step back into the gendered darkness we glimpsed before this time, focused on the special torment reserved for women enslaved in Rome. If you were a woman and a slave, your body was doubly claimed. Once by the law, and once by the expectations of society. You were servant, scapegoat, and scapular. You bore children you didn't own. You endured punishments tailored not only to subjugate, but to shame. Floggings for women slaves were often public ripped garments, heads shaved, and jeering spectators encouraged. It was meant to reinforce submission, humiliate, break spirit as well as skin. And if you resisted sexual advances from your master or his guests, that, too, could be punished as insubordination. There's a fringe tablet found in Ephesus describing a woman named Philema, punished for eyes too bold. Scholars debate what that meant. Did she look at someone too long? Smile? Refuse a touch? No one knows. But her punishment was inscribed 20 lashes and a night in the cold room. Roman citizen women had rules. Yes, but also shields. Dowries protected them. Laws acknowledged. Rape, though, enforcement varied. But enslaved women, the law didn't see rape. It saw a property dispute, If she was injured in the act, her owner might demand compensation, not because she was hurt, but because his asset was damaged. And if a female slave got pregnant, that raised further dilemmas. If the father was a citizen, the child was still born into slavery. Unless manumission was granted, which was rare, more often, the mother was punished, not the man. Accused of seduction, or of conspiring to breed advantageously, some slave women became concubines. Amikai offered better living conditions, but no real status. A mistress in name, never-in-law, and one mistake, one fall from favor, meant a plunge straight back into chains. Historians still argue whether female slaves found informal networks of protection, older women shielding the young, villa households creating alliances. The evidence is thin, but graffiti, epitaphs, and letters suggest a hidden world of sisterhood. Fragile, but real. So tonight, when you roll to your side and feel the sheets slip softly across your skin, think of Philema. Think of her lashes, her cold room, and the unspoken crimes of being a woman in a world that never meant to see her as anything but a shadow. You smell the incense before you see the flames. You're outside a small Christian house church quiet. Modest, hidden near the Transtiberine district. Inside, a man is reading softly. A woman holds a baby. The light is low, and all of them are about to be arrested. Tonight's page turns to religious outsiders and how punishment in Rome wasn't always about crime. Sometimes, it was about identity. Romans were tolerant. In theory, they worshipped many gods, absorbed deities from conquered lands, and generally let people believe what they wanted as long as it didn't threaten the state. But once it did, the reaction was swift and brutal. Jews, Christians, foreign cultists, they all faced suspicion, especially when they refused to sacrifice to the emperor or claimed exclusivity for their gods. That wasn't just heresy. It was treason. Punishment for religious defiance depended on class. A wealthy Roman who dabbled in Eastern mysteries might get a warning. Or polite exile. A poor Jew accused of proselytizing flogged. A slave woman caught hosting Christian meetings crucified. There's a fringe account from 202 CE of a Christian slave named Felicitas, pregnant when arrested. She was tortured alongside her mistress, Perpetua. When the time came, both were executed in the amphitheater. Felicitas gave birth in chains. The crowd cheered. Rome didn't fear God. It feared disorder, and religion was order's rival. Anything that encouraged loyalty outside the state or gave slaves hope beyond this life was a threat. So temples were raided, sacred books burned, and people, especially outsiders with no citizenship, were punished not for what they did, but for what they believed. Historians still argue whether Rome's religious persecutions were systemic or reactionary. Some see them as targeted, others as sporadic bursts of paranoia. Either way, the pattern is clear if you weren't Roman enough. You were disposable. So as your own beliefs guide you to peace tonight, know that in ancient Rome, some prayers had a price, and some gods, no matter how loving, led only to a cross. The palace walls gleam in the sunlight, their ivory tiles reflecting a warmth that doesn't reach your skin. You're inside the Domus Augustana now, where marble cools the floor and shadows cling to the statues. A man walks past you in a white tunic, hair trimmed in imperial fashion, Everyone steps aside. You recognize him immediately. He's not a senator. He's not a soldier. He's the emperor's favorite slave. Tonight, we're opening a vault within a vault. Imperial exceptions. Because when the emperor wanted someone dead, even the gods stepped aside. Roman law had its limits. It defined crimes, outlined procedures, gave citizens rights. But the emperor, he was the law. His word overrode precedent. His wrath dissolved protections. And sometimes, justice was rewritten with a nod. If a senator crossed him, execution could follow, trial optional. If a citizen insulted him in public banishment, confiscation. Disgrace. But if a slave offended the emperor, they might vanish, quietly, or in pieces. And it wasn't just slaves. Freedmen. Citizens. Even nobles could be punished in non-traditional ways if the emperor felt insulted. Nero burned Christians alive in his gardens. Caligula executed senators for their dreams. Domitian sent spies into private homes and punished people for jokes. There's a fringe tale of a mime who mocked the emperor's limp during a festival. The next day, his tongue was nailed to the stage. The emperor's power was both theatrical and terrifying. Punishments became symbols, spectacles, performance. Rome loved ritual, but emperors loved surprise. Historians still argue whether these acts were state terror or psychological warfare. Either way, the message was clear when the emperor stares. Blink correctly. So tonight, as you feel the safety of walls and rules around you, remember in Rome, all laws bent before one man's voice. And sometimes, that voice whispered your name before anyone else knew you were gone. The sun is brutal over the Appian Way, casting shadows from every olive tree like long fingers across the dust. You're walking alongside a legionnaire, sweat beading under his helmet as he slows, then stops. Up ahead. The road widens, and a hush falls over the column of marchers. Even the birds fall silent. You've arrived at the site of a massacre, not of soldiers, but of slaves. Tonight, we revisit Spartacus, not the man, but the aftermath, because when slaves rose up in rebellion, Rome answered with something colder than war: systematic extermination. In 71 BCE, after years of fighting, Spartacus's slave army was finally crushed by the legions of Crassus. What followed was not merely punishment, it was performance. 6,000 surviving slaves were crucified along the Via Appia, the main road between Capua and Rome. Mile after mile of crosses. No burial, no mercy. And they weren't hung as a group. They were spaced precisely one every 100 feet. Like grim mile markers. Travelers walked past moaning bodies for days. It wasn't just vengeance. It was advertising. Rome wanted to send one message: never rise again. And it worked. No major slave uprising followed for nearly 2 generations. The sheer scale of the punishment was unprecedented. Even enemies in foreign wars were treated better. Prisoners of war might be enslaved, ransomed, even released. But rebellious slaves, Rome saw them as defective tools. Broke instruments. They weren't punished as people. They were disposed of as warnings. There's a fringe account from an officer's diary. We changed the crosses twice. The corpses rotted too fast. No official historian confirms it, but even if apocryphal, the detail lingers like rot in the throat. Citizens who rebelled, say, during a political crisis, might be executed. Yes, but not like this. Not as fertilizer for a road. Crucifixion was forbidden for them, and certainly not in such grotesque scale. Historians still argue whether the slaughter was ordered by Crassus alone or sanctioned quietly by the Senate. Some say the emperor to be Pompey disapproved. Others claim he wished he'd thought of it first. And Spartacus. His body was never found. His name survived. Barely. But his soldiers' bones fed the birds until they crumbled into dust. So as you close your eyes tonight, drifting toward dreams. Remember in Rome, rebellion wasn't just crushed, it was staged. And the final act always played to the crowd. The grass here grows taller than your knees. You're in the countryside now, well beyond the city walls. No marble. No soldiers. Just wind brushing through wheat fields and the scent of manure. But something's off. A faint smell of char. You walk toward it and find the remains of a post. Burned. Splintered. Rope still coiled around it. This wasn't a place of justice. It was a place of punishment hidden. Unwitnessed. Private. Tonight, we contrast city and country because the style of punishment varied with the soil beneath your feet. In Rome proper, punishments were public, designed to control crowds, maintain order, and impress spectacle on the collective mind. But outside the city, on rural estates, everything changed. Slaves in the countryside were punished in silence. No amphitheater, no legal appeal. Just the master's word and whatever tools were closest on large farms, known as latifundia. Slave populations could be massive, hundreds, even thousands, especially in Sicily or North Africa. These estates were run like factories. Overseers wielded whips as casually as sticks. Punishment was frequent, unrecorded, and often fatal. There's a fringe record of a rural slave named Brucus, who was chained to a tree for 7 days as punishment for letting cattle wander. He died on day 5. The overseer simply hired another slave to dig a shallow grave. In the city, laws applied. Kind of. If a master killed a slave too publicly, there might be inquiry, whispers, risk. But in the countryside, there were no crowds. No lawyers. No senators strolling by. It was raw power, uninterrupted. Citizen oversight was rare in the provinces. The closest thing to justice might be a sympathetic bailiff or a priest. And even then, a slave's word was worth nothing without bruises fresh enough to see. And a master careless enough to leave witnesses. Some historians argue that rural cruelty fueled many of Rome's slave uprisings. The First Servile War in Sicily, sparked by beatings. The Second Starvation and murder. The fields bred fury and silence. And yet, the slaves kept working, sowing, reaping, harvesting the very empire that would never remember their names. So tonight, as you rest in a quiet room, know that some silence is not peace. It is fear, fed by distance. And Rome's countryside, sunlit and pastoral, was stitched with screams the wind carried away. The Senate chamber is empty now, just echoes in a hall where too many decisions were made with too little mercy. You walk slowly between the curule chairs, fingertips grazing the marble. Each one once held a man who decided how others should suffer. Not because of hatred, but because of policy. Tonight, We look at punishment not as accident or vengeance, but as tool. Rome used cruelty with purpose. Brutality was not a glitch. It was the plan. For Roman elites, pain was governance. Whether branding, whipping, or execution. Punishment served to reinforce the hierarchy. The worse the punishment, the clearer the lines between classes, between master and slave, citizen and foreigner, order and chaos. The 12 tables, Rome's foundational laws, were explicit penalties varied by status. Hit a citizen, pay a fine. Hit a slave, the master decides. Rape a citizen woman, trial. Rape a slave, pay the owner for damage. And these laws weren't broken in secret. They were proclaimed publicly, engraved, held up as ideals. There's a fringe quote attributed to a magistrate from Carthage: if they fear the whip, they obey the hand. Whether he said it or not, the logic held fear keeps wheels turning. Even military discipline reflected this thinking. Roman soldiers could be flogged, demoted, or executed for disobedience, but only if they lacked rank. Commanders were rarely punished. Punishment wasn't about justice. It was about preserving order. Historians argue whether this system was sustainable or self-poisoning. Some say it enabled Rome's longevity. Others, that it sowed the seeds of its collapse. Too much fear, not enough loyalty. But for centuries, the system worked. Cities rose. Wars were won. And in the background, slaves blew. Women suffered. Outsiders hung from crosses. All not in spite of Rome's laws, but because of them. So tonight, as your mind slows and sleep creeps near, remember that not all systems collapse in fire. Some rust quietly in the grooves of laws, too cruel to question. You find yourself back in the atrium of a wealthy Roman home. Light pools across the mosaic floor, catching the gold inlay on a fountain shaped like a dolphin. Nearby, two philosophers are speaking in low tones. One, pale, stoic. The other, dark-eyed and sharp. You catch a fragment, but should pain prove truth tonight? We tread uncertain ground, because even now, historians disagree why the Romans clung so tightly to unequal punishment. Was it fear, tradition, economics, a mix of all three? Let's break it apart. Fear first. Rome was built on conquest and held together with control. With so many slaves, so many outsiders, the elite feared rebellion constantly. Harsh punishment, they thought, was the only way to prevent collapse. Make obedience second nature. Make rebellion unimaginable. But tradition played its part too. The earliest Roman stories, Romulus killing Remus, Brutus executing his sons, were soaked in the idea that harsh justice equals civic health. Mercy, they warned, weakens the state. And then there's the economy. Slaves were Rome's engine. They farmed, cleaned, built, raised children. Their suffering kept prices low. Punishment wasn't personal. It was maintenance. Some thinkers, like Seneca, pushed back. Wrote essays on kindness, moderation. But even he owned hundreds of slaves. Even he never called for abolition. There's a fringe interpretation of the 12 tables that suggests early Roman punishments were more symbolic than brutal. but later centuries lost the nuance. The performance became real. Modern historians débattent endlessly. Were Romans more cruel than other societies, or just more organized in their cruelty? Did they enjoy suffering, or simply treat it like plumbing ugly? But necessary. You listen to the two men. Their words fade. One sighs, "Justice is the face we paint over fear." So tonight, as you drift off, know this sometimes. Pain isn't a failure of law. It is the law. And those who suffer beneath it are remembered only when the shadows are brave enough to speak. You're in a courtroom now, not ancient. But familiar? A clerk types softly. A judge leans forward. A defendant fidgets in a suit 2 sizes too big. There's tension in the air, not from swords or shackles, but something older. Something Roman. Tonight, we trace shadows because pieces of Rome still echo in our justice systems today. Modern societies claim equality under law, but how often does class change outcomes? How often do wealth, race, or nationality decide guilt and sentence more than facts? Rome codified inequality. We just struggle to explain it away. Look at debt prisons, plea bargains, disparate sentencing. In many places, poor defendants face longer jail time for minor crimes than the rich do for major ones. Bail systems echo Roman bond practices. Public shaming via media mirrors amphitheater spectacle. There's a fringe study comparing U.S. incarceration rates to Roman punishment data. The parallels are uncomfortable. Slavery ended. But penal labor remains. Branding stopped. But criminal records scar just as deeply, even language links. Custody. Tribunal. Appeal. Words born in marble halls now echo in fluorescent ones. Historians and legal scholars still argue, are we better now, or just better at hiding cruelty? Some call it evolution. Others, Reinvention, and the line between punishment and power still hazy. So tonight, as you lay safe behind locks, walls, and silence, remember this: Rome didn't disappear. It adapted, and in ways both subtle and sharp. The whip now wears a necktie. The candle flickers lower now. You're alone in a Roman storeroom. Dust dances in the air, and old tools hang from hooks like shadows of a world long gone. One last door remains, marked not with words, but a groove worn by thousands of hands. You push it open and walk straight into yourself. Tonight, we finish with a question. What if you were the slave? You followed every whip crack, watched every punishment. You felt the collars close, seen dignity stripped like bark. But now, you are the one tied to the post. You're cold, hungry, afraid. The magistrate doesn't ask your name. No one does. You think of your family, your old home, maybe across the sea, maybe just across town. All of it gone now. You try to remember your language, but pain makes memory blur. And then you hear it. A crowd. Not of enemies, but of people who chose not to look. That's what made the Roman system thrive. Not just law, not just class, but silence. The silence of citizens who loved order more than justice. The silence of philosophers who quoted ethics while sipping wine. The silence of history itself until now. Because tonight, we broke that silence. We walked their roads. Read their scars. named their shadows. And in doing so, we remember no system. No impede. No law is eternal, but the echo of those it crushed that lives on. In questions, in stories, in the quiet moments before sleep. So, now, as your breath slows, as your muscles melt into stillness, let the shadows drift back where they came from. Let the cruelty pass. Let the silence heal. Because tonight, you listened.